1 year later, the Sol Compact held its first formal summit, and it held it on Earth, because symbolism matters, and because Alara Okonkwo wanted it in Nairobi. Not Geneva, not New York, not any of the old centers of human power that the galaxy might have expected. Nairobi, her city, the place where she had grown up, learning that the world was larger than the room you were standing in, and that the people laughing at you were smaller than they thought. 61 species sent delegations. They came in ships of every design, sleek Drenath cruisers and modest Leth transports, and strange organic vessels from species whose names humans were still learning to pronounce. And they descended through Earth's atmosphere, and the clouds and the weather, and the sheer biological noise of a living planet hit them like a wall of sensation. Because most galactic diplomacy happened on sterile stations and neutral platforms, and Earth was neither sterile nor neutral, and green and wet and alive, in a way that made visiting species understand something about humanity that no data file could convey. These people had evolved in a place that was trying to kill them every single day, and they had not left. They had not retreated to orbital habitats or climate-controlled domes. They had stayed and fought and built, and the stubbornness of that choice was written into every human city, every park, every road that wound through terrain that geology had not made convenient. The summit venue was the Kenyatta International Convention Center, which Alara had chosen because it was not grand enough, because it was a working building in a working city, and not a monument to anything except the ordinary business of people getting things done. And this was the point. This was always the point. Humanity did not need a crystal podium or a tiered amphitheater or a chamber designed to make someone feel small. They needed a room with good chairs and strong coffee and a view of a city that never stopped moving. Sirith arrived 3 days early. She had spent the past 10 months as the Sol Compact's Rithari liaison, a position that did not officially exist, according to her government, because her government had not acknowledged her application, and had instead declared her a private citizen acting without authority, which was the Rithari way of disowning someone without using the word. She did not care, or rather she cared enormously, and the caring lived in her chest like a hot stone she carried everywhere. But she had made her choice, and the choice was bigger than the pain, and she had learned this from watching humans, because humans seem to specialize in carrying pain and building things at the same time. In 10 months, she had become one of the most effective diplomats in the Compact, translating between Rithari cultural expectations and human directness, smoothing interactions that might have broken down. Without someone who understood both languages not just linguistically but emotionally, and the other species had begun requesting her specifically for difficult negotiations, because she had a gift for finding the sentence that made everyone in the room feel heard, without anyone feeling patronized. The Rithari government watched her success through intelligence channels and said nothing publicly and seethed privately, and this was also a kind of communication. The summit opened on a Tuesday morning, with Nairobi's equatorial sun pouring through the convention center's windows, and Alara stood at the front of the room, not on a podium. There was no podium. She had specifically forbidden podiums. And she welcomed 61 species to Earth with a speech that lasted 4 minutes. She did not mention the Concorde. She did not mention the laughter. She talked about what was being built, not what had been broken. And this restraint was its own kind of power. Everyone in the room knew the history, and everyone was waiting for her to reference it, and she never did, and the absence of grievance was louder than any accusation could have been. The Compact was working. Not perfectly. Nothing involving 61 species with different biologies and cultures and histories and grudges could work perfectly. But it was working with a transparency and adaptability that the Concorde had never achieved, because the Concorde had been built on hierarchy, and the Compact was built on reciprocity. and these two foundations produce very different buildings. Leadership rotated quarterly as promised. Earth had chaired the first quarter, and then handed the gavel to the Left, who handled it with such quiet competence that several larger species had to recalibrate their assumptions about what small and peaceful actually meant. The Helios Gate Network was back online, jointly administered by a committee of 12 species with human engineers, maintaining the technical infrastructure and training alien technicians to eventually take over. Because this was the other thing about humanity that the galaxy was learning. They did not hoard, they taught. They built capacity in others, and this generosity was not weakness, it was the longest game anyone had ever played. The Rithari Empire had not collapsed. This was important, because the narrative of revenge would have required their collapse, and the narrative was wrong. The Rithari were old and wealthy and resilient, and they absorbed the economic shock the way a large animal absorbs a wound, not fatally, but with a limp that changed how they moved through the world. Their trade routes still functioned, but the volume had dropped because ships preferred the complex networks, and the complex networks were faster and cheaper because they used human infrastructure that the Rithari could not access. Their cultural influence, once immense, the Rithari had been tastemakers and opinion shapers for millennia, had faded in the way that influence fades when the audience walks out of the theater, not with a dramatic exit, but with a gradual emptying of seats until the performers realize they are speaking to a room that is mostly echo. The old Concord still existed. 12 species remained, the Rithari, the Veloci, and 10 others who stayed for various reasons, ranging from genuine loyalty to bureaucratic inertia, to the simple inability to admit that the institution they had built their identities around was no longer the center of anything. The Concord Hall on Valeth Prime still hosted sessions and passed resolutions, and maintained its protocols, and the crystal podium still stood in the center of the chamber. But the chamber was mostly empty now, and the podium caught the light differently when there was no one standing on it. Less like a stage, and more like a monument to something that had already happened. The Rithari Commerce Bureau, 4 months after the dissolution. He did not join the compact or leave Rithari space. He simply resigned and took a position at a private trading firm that did business with everyone, regardless of political affiliation. And when Keth asked him why, he said, "Because the numbers do not care about pride, and I am tired of pretending they do." Keth did not argue, because Keth had run the same numbers and reached the same conclusion, and was considering the same resignation, and they both knew it, and neither said it aloud, because some things between colleagues do not need words. On the final evening of the summit, Ilara stood on a balcony of the convention center and looked out at Nairobi at dusk. The city spread below her in layers of light, old buildings and new ones, markets and offices, roads built by one generation and expanded by the next, the accumulated evidence of a species that had spent its entire existence building on top of its own ruins, and somehow making the ruins part of the foundation. Her aide found her there. "Ambassador, the closing reception is starting." "I know." "The Drenath Admiral wants to discuss joint patrol protocols." "I know." "Are you satisfied?" Ilara did not answer for a long time. She was not thinking about the compact, or the treaties, or the Rithari. She was thinking about a crystal podium on a station called Valeth Prime, and the sound of pens rolling across its surface, a tiny clicking that nobody had heard except her and the microphones, and one old Rithari delegate who had listened to the recording enough times to find it. She was thinking about 11 seconds. 11 seconds in a room that smelled like recycled air and old power. 11 seconds during which 400 species had decided that humanity was a joke. 11 seconds that had cost the galaxy more than any war, because wars end with treaties, and this had ended with their cancellation. "Satisfied is not the word," she said. Her aide waited. It is not revenge, and it is not justice, and it is not satisfaction, Ilara said, still looking at the city, at the lights coming on one by one as the equatorial dark settled over the rooftops. It is just the thing that happens when you stop waiting for someone to give you what you are going to build for yourself anyway. She turned from the balcony, and she walked into the reception, and 61 species greeted her, and the room was warm and loud, and full of the particular energy that fills a space when something new is being made by people who have chosen to be there. Unit. The species of soul were not combative by nature, nor passive by choice. They possessed a trait the elder civilizations had lost and could not name: the memory of what it costs to be underestimated. They did not forget. They did not forgive. They built. And that was the end of it. And that was the beginning of everything else. 5 weeks after the dissolution, the Galactic Concord called an emergency session, and the chamber was half empty. This was the detail that the media focused on, not the agenda, not the speeches, not the procedural motions, but the empty seats. Rows and rows of them, stretching up into the tiered amphitheater like missing teeth in a mouth that used to smile with confidence. And every empty seat was a species that had already begun back-channel negotiations with Earth, and did not see the point in pretending otherwise. The Veloci chair opened the session with a traditional invocation of unity and cooperation, and the words echoed off the empty seats and came back sounding hollow, the way a song sounds hollow when you sing it in a room that used to be full of people who sang it with you. Vorath was there. He sat in the Rithari delegation section, a prime position near the center of the chamber, a position his species had held for over 1,000 years. He watched the proceedings with mandibles that had not clicked in days, and the other delegates noticed this, the way you notice when a clock that has been ticking for years goes silent. The emergency motion was simple in language and staggering in implication. The Concord formally requested humanity's return, not as a provisional observer, not as a full voting member, but as a founding tier member, the highest status in the Concord's hierarchy, a designation held by only 5 species in the institution's entire history. The Veloci chair presented it as an offer of unprecedented generosity. It was, of course, an act of unprecedented desperation. The quantum link to Solcom was opened, and Ilara Okonkwo appeared on the chamber's central holographic display, and the delegates who had been present 5 weeks ago felt something shift in the room when her face materialized. Not fear exactly, but a kind of heightened attention, the way prey animals become very still when a clock goes silent. They realized the thing they thought was a rock has eyes. Ilara looked the same, composed, precise, unreadable, but something had changed in the geometry of her presence, the way she held space on the screen, and it took the more perceptive delegates a moment to identify what it was. She was not standing at a podium. She was sitting behind a desk, on Earth, in what appeared to be a modest office with a window that showed a city skyline, and a sky full of actual weather, clouds and sun, and the distant suggestion of rain, and the casualness of it was devastating, because it meant she was not performing diplomacy. She was conducting business. Ambassador Okonkwo, the Veloci chair began, the Concord extends its formal invitation. I have read the proposal, Ilara said, and the interruption was so clean and so calm that the chair stopped speaking, the way you stop walking when you realize the ground has changed under your feet. Declines. The chamber made a sound, not laughter this time, but something closer to the collective intake of breath, the sound of letting their understanding of what was happening. Ambassador, we are not finished, Ilara said, and the we landed differently than it had 5 weeks ago, heavier, the pronoun of a species that had stopped asking for permission. The Sol Confederation appreciates the Concord's offer and recognizes the sincerity of the gesture. And she said sincerity without irony, which somehow made it worse. But humanity has no interest in returning to an institution that treats contribution as entertainment. She paused, not for effect, or perhaps entirely for effect. It was impossible to tell with her, and that impossibility was itself a weapon. Instead, Earth proposes a new framework. She outlined it in 6 minutes. The Sol Compact, an open, diplomatic, and economic alliance built on 3 principles that she stated with the clarity of someone who had been writing them in her head for 42 years. First, no hierarchy of species, no tiered membership, no senior and junior designations. Every signatory enters as an equal, regardless of age or technological advancement, or how long they have been traveling between stars. Second, contribution is measured and reciprocated, not by what a species was 1,000 years ago, but by what they build and share today. And every member's standing is reviewed annually, based on what they have given, not what they claim to deserve. Third, and this was the one that made Vorath's carapace itch, any species may join, from any background, with any history, provided they submit to a single requirement. Mutual respect, verified and demonstrated, Elara said, not performed, not declared, demonstrated, through action, through sustained and measurable engagement with every other member as. The chamber was quiet. The Sol Compact is open for applications effective immediately, Elara said. Earth will serve as initial chair on a rotating basis. Quarterly transitions, no permanent leadership. She looked directly into the holographic pickup, and for a moment it felt like she was looking at every delegate individually. A trick of psychology or technology, or perhaps just the particular weight of a gaze that had spent 42 years watching from the observer's gallery. We are not asking anyone to leave the Concord, she said. We are offering an alternative for those who want one. The quantum link closed. The chamber erupted, not in laughter, but in the chaotic overlapping sound of 300 species, all trying to talk at once, which is what happens when the ground shifts, and everyone needs to find their footing at the same time. Within the first day, 47 species applied to the Sol Compact. Their application arrived 11 minutes after Elara's broadcast ended, pre-written and ready, and the speed of it made it clear that the Leth had been in communication with Earth throughout, and had known what was coming, which meant the small, quiet species that everyone had overlooked for centuries had been paying attention in ways that now looked less like meekness and more like strategy. The Drenith hegemony applied third, which surprised many, because the Drenith were proud and militaristic, and not known for joining things they did not control. But Admiral Korath had done the math on his half-blind sensor grid, and the math said that pride was expensive, and blindness was more expensive, and the humans had something his people needed, and the price of getting it was treating them as equals. The price of not getting it was worse. Species kept applying. Small ones, and medium ones, and a few large ones. A steady stream that turned into a river, that turned into something the Concord could not ignore, because every application was a vote. Not a formal vote, but the kind that matters more. The kind you cast with your feet when you walk out of a room. The Rithari did not apply. Vorath sat in his quarters and watched the application list grow on his personal display. And his mandibles were so still they might have been carved from stone. And the young diplomat who brought him his evening reports noticed that he had not eaten, and that the lights in his quarters were set to their lowest level, and that the recording, the 11 seconds, was cued on his audio player. Paused, waiting. She did not comment on any of this, because commenting on a senior delegate's private pain was not done in Rithari culture. But she looked at him with compound eyes that held something complicated in their facets. Her name was Cyrith, and she was young by Rithari standards, barely a century old, and she had been in the chamber that day when the laughter started, and she had not laughed. She had watched Elara Okonkwo's face, and she had seen the stillness, and she had understood something that most of her species had missed. The human was not humiliated. The human was making a decision, and the decision was being made in real time, behind eyes that showed nothing. And the decision was going to change everything. Cirith went back to her own quarters after delivering the reports, and she sat at her personal terminal, and she opened a new document, and she began typing. Not a report, not a memo, but a personal application to the Sol Compact, requesting a position as a species liaison. She did not tell Vorath. She did not tell anyone. She typed with mandibles clicking softly, not the click of amusement that her species was known for, but the click of concentration, of someone building something careful and precise in a language that was not her own. And when she finished, she read it twice, and then she transmitted it. Before she could change her mind. On Earth, Director Meyer reviewed the day's compact applications in her office at Solcom headquarters, and most of them were stray feces seeking trade access, military cooperation, cultural exchange. But one made her stop. A personal application from a Rithari diplomat named Cirith, requesting liaison status. Meyer flagged it for Alara with a 2-word annotation. Interesting timing. Alara read it that evening on her balcony in Nairobi, the city spreading out below her in the warm dark. The sounds of traffic and music, and 14 billion people living their lives drifting up through the humid air. And she looked at Cyrith's application for a long time. A Rithari who wanted to build bridges. Alara thought about 11 seconds of laughter, and she thought about the pens rolling on the podium. And she thought about the old thing with teeth that lived in her chest, and she made a decision that was not about revenge and was not about forgiveness, but was about something harder than both. Approve it, she told Meyer. The Rithari will see it as an insult, one of their own defecting. The Rithari will see it as a door, Ilara said. Whether they walk through it is their choice. She set down her coffee, and she watched the Nairobi skyline, and somewhere in the dark, a Rithari diplomat was waiting for a response that would change her life. And somewhere in the dark, a Concord that had stood for millennia was learning what it felt like to be provisional. 3 weeks after the dissolution, the Drenath hegemony discovered they were blind. Not literally, their eyes worked fine, all 6 of them per individual. But their military sensor grid, the vast network of detection arrays and early warning systems that protected their borders and monitored 300 star systems, ran on a signal compression codec. This codec had been developed 9 years ago by a human engineer, Patricia Yoon, and licensed to the Concord under a technology sharing treaty that no longer existed. Without the codec, their sensors could still detect things, but the data was raw and uncompressed. And trying to process it was like trying to drink from a river through a straw. The information was there, but it came in so fast and so thick that their systems choked on it. Within a week, their fleet detection range had dropped by half. Admiral Korath of the Drenath Third Fleet stood on the bridge of his flagship and stared at a sensor display that showed him a fuzzy approximation of what used to be crystal clarity. And his jaw muscles worked in the way that Drenath jaws work, when their owner is considering violence, but has not yet identified a target. Can our engineers replicate the codec? He asked. They have been trying for 6 days, his intelligence officer said. The math is beyond them. It is a compression algorithm, not a weapon. With respect, Admiral, our chief engineer says it might as well be. The human who designed it used a mathematical framework our people have never encountered. Something derived from a branch of computation theory that humans apparently developed for entertainment purposes. Entertainment. They call it music theory, Admiral. Korath closed all 6 of his eyes, 1 pair at a time, which was the Drenath equivalent of counting to 10. Across the galaxy, similar revelations were unfolding, like a string of small explosions, each one illuminating a dependency that, Nobody had noticed when the lights were on. The Veloci medical stations discovered that 6 of their most commonly used pharmaceuticals relied on a protein synthesis process that a human biochemist had published openly 14 years ago. Published, not sold, not licensed under restrictive terms, just given to the galaxy like a gift left on a doorstep. And now the Veloci pharmacologists were trying to reverse engineer a process they had been using daily without understanding, because why would you learn to build a thing you were given for free? The answer came back from the research teams in language that was technical, but whose meaning was simple. It would take 2 years minimum to develop an independent alternative, and in the meantime, 6 medications would face shortage. The Veloci health minister read the report and then read it again, and then sat very still in her office, looking at the ornamental fountain on her desk that circulated water in patterns meant to promote calm, and the fountain did not help at all. On 17 worlds, species that had adopted human agricultural hybrids discovered that the seed stocks were proprietary, not locked, not weaponized, but designed to work optimally with a soil treatment process that was part of the same technology sharing framework that had just been dissolved. And without the treatment, the crops would still grow, but yields would drop by 30 to 40%. 30 to 40%. That number sat in agricultural ministry briefings across the galaxy, like a bomb that had already gone off, and was just waiting for everyone to notice the crater. The Rithari were perhaps the least affected materially. They were an old and wealthy species with deep reserves and redundant systems. But they were the most affected in the way that mattered more, the way that kept Vorath awake at night, staring at the ceiling of his quarters. They were the ones who had laughed loudest. Galactic media, which was not controlled by any single species, but which followed attention the way water follows gravity, had turned the 11-second recording into a symbol. And the symbol was not of human weakness, but of Rithari cruelty. And every day the commentators and analysts and opinion makers replayed the footage not of the spinning human ship, but of Vorath's mandibles clicking with amusement while Alara Okonkwo stood motionless at the podium. The narrative had flipped, and it had flipped so fast that Vorath suspected the humans had planned for that too. He was correct, but he would never be able to prove it. Meanwhile, the small species called the Leth were doing something that made every other Concord member nervous. They were thriving. The Leth had been a minor power, a quiet and peaceful civilization that most species forgot about between council sessions. But they had not left that day in the chamber, and Alara Okonkwo had noticed, and within 48 hours of the dissolution, Earth had extended a bilateral trade and cooperation agreement to the Leth that was so generous it made veteran diplomats across the galaxy choke on their morning beverages. Full trade access at preferential rates, continued use of human logistics systems, maintained Helios Gate access for Leth-registered vessels, agricultural support, medical patent sharing, cultural exchange, everything the Leth had before and more, delivered with a warmth and speed that made it clear this was not charity. It was reward. It was humanity saying, in the loudest possible silence, "We remember who did not laugh." The Leth economy grew 9% in 3 weeks, a staggering number for any species, but especially for one that had spent centuries in the shadow of larger powers. And other small species noticed, and they began making quiet inquiries through back channels. Could they too establish bilateral relations with Earth? Could they too access the systems and resources that had been withdrawn from the Concord? Earth said yes to every single one that had not participated in the mockery. Earth said, "Let us think about it," to the ones that had laughed, but were now willing to acknowledge it. Earth said nothing at all to the Rithari. The silence was worse than any weapon, because a weapon gives you something to fight against, and silence gives you nothing but your own reflection. Taven tracked all of this from his console at the Rithari Commerce Bureau, and the picture he assembled was not one of human revenge, but of something more sophisticated and more frightening. It was architecture. It was the careful construction of a new economic and diplomatic framework that routed around the Concorde the way water routes around a stone, not destroying it, but making it irrelevant. "They are not punishing us," he told Keth one evening, when the station lights had dimmed to simulate dusk, and they were both still at their consoles because there was nowhere else to be when your civilization's influence was evaporating in real time. "They are replacing us," Keth said. "No, worse than that. They are making replacement unnecessary, because they are not building a competing structure. They are building an alternative, and alternatives do not need to defeat the original. They just need to exist." Keth looked at him for a long time. "You admire them," Keth said, and it was not a question. Taven did not answer, because the answer was complicated, and because admiration was not the right word. The right word was something closer to recognition, the thing you feel when you watch someone execute a plan so thoroughly that you cannot help but respect the craftsmanship, even as it dismantles your world. Alara Okonkwo sent a message to Vorath on the 21st day after the dissolution. It was personal, not diplomatic, routed through private channels. And when Vorath opened it, he expected threats or demands, or perhaps the gloating he had been bracing himself for since the currencies crashed. It contained none of these things. It contained the recording of the laughter, the 11 seconds, unedited, the sound of 400 species filling the Concorde Hall with mockery, and a single annotation in clean diplomatic script, archived for historical reference. Vorath listened to it once. Then he listened to it again. The third time he listened, he heard something he had not heard before. Underneath the laughter, almost inaudible, the sound of Ilara's pens rolling across the crystal podium, a tiny clicking that the recording's sensitive microphones had captured. And he realized that while the entire galaxy had been laughing, the human ambassador had been listening to her pens fall. And she had been counting the seconds. And she had been doing math. He closed the message. Dark of his quarters and his mandibles were still, and his carapace felt heavy in a way that had nothing to do with gravity, and everything to do with the slow understanding that the species his people had laughed at had not been weak or foolish or premature. They had been patient, and patience, he was learning, was the most terrifying weapon in the galaxy, because you could not see it coming, and you could not fight it when it arrived. And by the time you understood what it was, the math was already done, and the pens were already rolling, and the silence was already louder than any laughter had ever been. Taven's console started screaming at him 6 hours after the broadcast, and he spilled his nutrient broth all over his thorax. He was a mid-level trade analyst for the Rethari Commerce Bureau, which meant he spent his days monitoring commodity flows and exchange rates across interstellar markets. And it was boring work, profoundly boring, the kind of work that made you forget you lived on a space station orbiting a gas giant, because the numbers were the same everywhere, and numbers do not care about scenery. The first alert was a currency fluctuation in the Veloci Trade Index. He dismissed it. The second alert was a cascade failure in 3 freight routing systems simultaneously. He sat up. The third alert was every single light on his console going amber at once, which had never happened before, which was not supposed to be able to happen. And Taven stared at it the way a person stares at a crack forming in a dam. Not yet afraid. That fear is coming, and it is bringing friends. What in the deep shells, he muttered, and his mandibles clicked in a nervous pattern that his coworkers knew meant trouble. He pulled up the freight routing logs, and the data made no sense. Pathways that had been active for decades were showing as terminated, not disrupted, not rerouted, terminated, as if someone had reached into the architecture of interstellar commerce and pulled out a load-bearing wire. Then the formal notices started arriving. They came in a flood, a synchronized quantum burst transmission that hit every Concorde species simultaneously. 412 separate treaty dissolution documents, each one formatted with such precise and impeccable diplomatic language that it took Taven 3 readings to understand what he was looking at. Humanity was leaving. Not one treaty, not a handful, not a strategic selection. Every single agreement the Sol Confederation had ever signed with. Any Concord species was being formally and legally revoked. And the documents were so clean, so perfectly structured, so meticulously referenced that it was clear this was not a reaction. This was a plan. Taven's supervisor appeared behind him, a senior analyst named Keth, who had been with the Bureau for 40 years, and who had a permanent expression of mild irritation that deepened now into something closer to genuine alarm. "How bad?" Keth asked. "I do not know yet," Taven said, and that was the most frightening answer he could have given, because Taven always knew that was his job. That was why they kept him in this boring room, staring at boring numbers, because Taven could read a market disruption the way a doctor reads a scan, and right now the scan was showing something he had never seen before. On Earth, the activation of Operation Quiet Room unfolded with the mechanical precision of something that had been rehearsed in the dark for 19 years. Every human embassy across 31 star systems received the same coded transmission at the same moment. Not a message so much as a key turning in a lock that had been installed long ago and tested monthly, and maintained with the kind of care that only paranoid species lavish on their contingency plans. The ambassadors did not panic, because they had trained for this. In the Drenach system, Ambassador Chen closed the embassy with a formal ceremony that lasted exactly 9 minutes, shook hands with every local staff member, and boarded the evacuation transport with 2 suitcases and a small cactus she had kept on her desk for 11 years. In the Leth homeworld, Ambassador Reeves spent an extra hour personally contacting Leth officials to assure them that bilateral relations could continue outside the Concord framework, and the Leth, who had not laughed, who had sat quiet in that chamber, accepted immediately with something that looked like relief. In the Ritherai Trade Hub, Ambassador Osei left a handwritten note on his desk that read, "It was a pleasure, mostly," and was on a transport before the local authorities even knew the embassy was closing. The human traders pulled out of galactic commodity exchanges mid-cycle. This was the part that hurt first, because money is a nerve that every species shares, and when 31 systems worth of human trade volume vanished from the exchanges in a single rotation, the effect was not gradual. It was a cliff, a sudden absence where there had been foundation, and 3 interstellar currencies crashed before the next market cycle opened. The Veloci credit lost 9% of its value in 4 hours. The Ritherai trade index dropped so hard that automated circuit breakers kicked in and froze trading, which had not happened since a war 60 years ago. And then the Helios gates went dark. This was the part that caused real terror, because the Helios Gate Network was the circulatory system of galactic travel, a series of micro-wormhole relay stations that allowed ships to cross vast distances without the fuel costs and time delays of conventional FTL. And humanity had built them, had designed and constructed and calibrated every single one, and then gifted them to the Concord 12 years ago as a gesture of goodwill. And everyone had accepted them the way you accept a road. You drive on it every day, and you forget that someone had to build it, and that someone could turn it off. Humanity turned it off. Not with violence, not with sabotage, with a polite automated message that broadcast on all frequencies in 400 languages. The Sol Confederation Helios Gate Network will suspend operations in 72 standard hours. All vessels currently in transit are advised to complete their journeys or exit to conventional FTL. We apologize for any inconvenience. Inconvenience. Taven read that line 4 times, and each time it got worse, the way a polite note gets worse when you realize it is attached to something that is going to ruin your life. Ships began scrambling. Thousands of vessels, across hundreds of systems, trying to complete transits before the gates closed. And the 72-hour grace period was generous. It was more than generous. It was the kind of courtesy that made the whole thing worse. Because it meant humanity was not angry. They were organized. Taven ran the projections, and the numbers made his carapace itch in the way it only itched when he was truly afraid. Without the Helios gates, transit times across Concord space would increase by an average of 300%. Fuel costs would spike. Perishable cargo would rot in holds. Medical supply chains would stretch and snap, and the species that had built their economies around gate access would find themselves stranded on islands of their own. "Making, Kef," he said, and his voice had a harmonic in it that Rithari use only when delivering very bad news. "It is not just the gates." "What else?" "The routing algorithms, the freight logistics systems. They are human-designed, human-licensed, and the license terminations are in the treaty dissolution package." Keth was quiet for a long time. "How much of our freight infrastructure uses human logistics systems?" he asked. 60%, Taven said, and the number sat in the air between them like a blade. "Galactic average?" 60%. "That cannot be correct. I have checked it 4 times. Kef's mandibles went still, which was worse than clicking, because stillness in a Rithari meant the mind was working so hard that the body had shut down its idle processes, the way a ship diverts power from lights to engines when it needs everything for thrust. Across the Concord, the same realization was rippling. Outward. Not like a wave, but like a withdrawal. Like the tide pulling back to reveal exactly how much of the ocean floor everyone had been standing on without knowing it. The Veloci Council Chair received 412 treaty dissolution notices on her personal terminal, and she read the final line of each one because they were all the same, and she read it over and over as if repetition might change its meaning. Humanity thanks the Concord for 42 years of educational observation. Educational observation. Not bitter, not angry, not threatening. Educational. As if the 42 years of being laughed at and dismissed and denied had been a class they were taking, a curriculum they had completed, and now they were graduating, and the diploma was the sound of every door in the galaxy closing at once. She tried to contact the human delegation ship at Valeth Prime. It was already gone. Alara Okonkwo was halfway back to Sol space by the time. The first currency crashed, sitting in the command cabin of the delegation vessel with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, watching the quantum link feed as the notifications poured in. Treaty received, treaty received, treaty received. 412 confirmations blinking on her screen like a heartbeat. She did not smile. She drank the cold coffee, and she watched the lights blink. And somewhere in her chest, the old thing with teeth was quiet for the first time in 42 years. Not gone, not healed, just quiet, the way a machine goes quiet when it has finished the work it was built for. Her aide knocked on the cabin door. "Ambassador, the Leth have requested bilateral discussions." "Accept immediately," Alara said. "Full terms, preferential rates, give them everything they ask for, and then give them 10% more." The Leth were the ones who did not laugh. Yes, Alara said, they were. She set down the coffee, and she looked at the stars through the viewport, and the stars looked the same as they always had, cold and far away, and completely indifferent to the empires that burned and built beneath them. Taven worked through the night, running numbers that got worse every hour, and when the station's artificial dawn broke across his console, he put his head in his claws and made a sound that his species makes only in private. A low keening that means, "I understand now, and I wish I did not." The galaxy had laughed for 11 seconds. The silence that followed was going to last much longer. The Galactic Concord Hall on Valeth Prime smelled the way old power always smells: recycled air and self-congratulation. Ilara Okonkwo stood at the petitioner's podium, a raised platform made of translucent crystal that the Veloci had designed centuries ago to make whoever stood on it feel small. And it worked. It worked on every species that had ever stood there begging for something. But Ilara was from Nairobi, and she had begged for things in rooms far worse than this one. She was not going to let alien architecture do what poverty and politics had failed to do. She held the petition datapad loosely at her side. 42 years. That was how long humanity had held provisional observer status in the Galactic Concord, which was the polite way of saying, you may watch, but you may not speak. You may listen, but you may not vote. You may contribute, but you may not matter. 42 years of sending their best, of exceeding every benchmark the Concord had ever placed in front of them, of building infrastructure and sharing technology, and smiling through diplomatic receptions where other species treated human ambassadors like clever pets who had learned to use a fork. Today, that was supposed to end. The Sol Confederation formally petitions for elevation to full voting member status, Ilara said, and her voice carried clean and steady through the translation matrices that converted her words into 400 distinct languages simultaneously. The chamber was enormous, a tiered amphitheater that could seat representatives from over 600 species, though today only about 300 were present, because many considered the human petition too boring to attend in person. The Veloci chair, a tall and willowy being with skin like pale bark and eyes that moved too independently of each other, acknowledged the petition with a slow gesture that meant, you may present your case. She did not rush, and she did not perform, and she did not beg. She laid out 42 years of data, the Helios Gate network that humanity had designed and built and gifted to the Concord. The agricultural hybrid programs that now fed 17 species. The logistics algorithms that routed 60% of galactic freight. The medical patents shared freely. The cultural exchange programs. The disaster relief operations on worlds whose names most humans could not pronounce. It took 11 minutes. When she finished, the chamber was quiet in that particular way that large rooms get quiet, when everyone is waiting for someone else to speak first. The Rithari delegate spoke first. His name was Vorath, and he was ancient even by the standards of a species that lived for centuries, an insectoid being with a carapace the color of burnt copper, and mandibles that clicked when he was amused, and right now they were clicking. Delegation for its thorough and, click-click, enthusiastic presentation. Ilara watched him, and her face did nothing. However, Vorath continued, and he activated a holographic display that materialized in the center of the chamber. Perhaps a moment of perspective is in order. The display showed a recording. It was old footage, grainy by galactic standards, of humanity's first attempt at FTL navigation, a test flight from 38 years ago, where the ship had exited its jump 17 light-years off target. Spinning end over end, the pilot screaming in a way that was unmistakably and universally the sound of someone who had made a terrible mistake. The chamber laughed. Not all of them, not at first, but the Rithari delegation started it, and the sound spread the way fire spreads through dry grass, species after species joining in, because laughter is one of the few things that translates perfectly across biology. And within seconds, entire Concord Hall was roaring with it. 11 seconds. Ilara counted because counting was what she did when the other thing tried to rise up in her chest. The old thing. The thing with teeth. 11 seconds of 400 species laughing at humanity in a room designed to make you feel small. The Veloci chair did not intervene. The recording played on a loop. The ship spinning, the pilot screaming, the jump coordinates blinking red. And Vorath's mandibles clicked and clicked and clicked. Ilara looked down at her hands on the podium. Her pens had fallen from the datapad holder. 3 of them. rolling across the crystal surface with a tiny sound that nobody could hear over the laughter, but that she tracked with absolute focus, watching the slim silver cylinders roll toward the edge like they were the most important objects in the universe. Her pens, her glorious pens, rolling toward the edge of a podium on an alien space station. 400 species laughed at everything her world had ever built. She caught them. 1, 2, 3, fingers closing around each one with a precision that had nothing to do with pens, and everything to do with keeping her hands from shaking. And she slid them back into the holder and straightened the datapad, and she looked up at the chamber with eyes that had gone flat and dark and absolutely still. The laughter took another 4 seconds to die. Some delegates noticed her face. The Leth ambassador, a small and quiet being from a peaceful world, stopped laughing before the others and looked at Alara with something that might have been recognition, or might have been the early stages of fear, the kind you feel when you realize the person you are laughing at is not embarrassed, but is instead doing math. Vorath finished his display with a final click of his mandibles. The petition for elevated status is, respectfully, premature, he said. Said respectfully, made it clear that the word was decorative. The vote was a formality after that. Denied with prejudice, which meant humanity could not re-petition for another 20 standard cycles. Alara gathered her materials, and she stepped down from the crystal podium, and she walked through the chamber with a posture that was not defeated, and was not angry, and was not anything that any of the delegates could read, which unnerved the ones who were paying attention, because every other species that had ever been denied at that podium had shown something, rage or tears or quiet devastation, and this human woman showed nothing at all. She walked like someone leaving a room she had already left in her mind 11 seconds ago. The broadcast went out live across 4,000 worlds. On Earth, 14 billion people watched. The human delegation ship was docked in the diplomatic ring of Valeth Prime, a modest vessel compared to the ornate cruisers of the elder species, and Alara boarded it alone because she had sent her staff away an hour before the vote, which they would later realize meant she had known. She walked past the briefing room, and past the communications bay, and past the small galley, where someone had left coffee brewing, because the delegation always left coffee brewing as a small act of defiance against the Concorde's bland nutritional dispensers. She went to the command cabin, and she sealed the door, and she stood there for a moment in the dark. Then she opened a direct quantum link to Solcom, Earth's unified command authority. And the face that appeared on the screen was Director Ion Mir, who had been waiting, who had been watching the broadcast, who already knew. They laughed, Alara said. I heard. 11 seconds. We counted. Alara sat down in the command chair, and she let out one breath, one that carried in it every year of smiling and waiting, exceeding benchmarks and being called provisional. They are not going to stop, she said. Director Meyer's expression did not change, and that was the thing about Solcom, about the people who built contingency plans for 19 years and updated them quarterly and gave them names like Operation Quiet Room. Their faces did not change, because the feeling underneath had been there so long it had become architecture. No, Meyer said, they are not. A pause. Activate it? Meyer asked. Alara looked at the screen, and somewhere behind her eyes, the pens were still rolling across that crystal podium, and the laughter was still echoing in a chamber that smelled like recycled air and old power. Activate it. The quantum link closed. Alara sat alone in the dark of the command cabin, and she listened to the silence, and somewhere deep in the bones of 31 star systems, a plan that had been sleeping for 19 years opened its eyes.